10,000 men for a bridge, 3 days for their bodies to vanish into the sea. Persia's glory wasn't paid in gold, it was paid in flesh. Every plank that held Xerxes above the Hellespont was nailed with a life. So who truly funded the divinity of a king who called himself God? The chronicles fell silent. The bones beneath the strait did not. If you value the record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. History remembers Xerxes as the gilded villain of 300, a jeweled colossus struck down by Spartan valor. But the truth was far darker and far less cinematic. Because the real Xerxes never needed to fight bare-chested heroes on the battlefield. His true war was fought against nature itself, and against the limits of human endurance. In 480 BCE, when the Persian army prepared to cross from Asia into Greece, Xerxes faced the impossible: how to command a sea. He ordered 2 immense pontoon bridges across the Hellespont, a marvel of logistics. An empire's veins stretched across the water, but storms tore them apart before his soldiers could march. For most kings, it would have been misfortune. For Xerxes, it was blasphemy. The chronicles say he responded as only a god would. He ordered the waves whipped 300 times. Chains were thrown into the sea as punishment. A plaque was cast, condemning the waters for insolence. And as the sound of lashes cracked against the surf, the soldiers watching knew what this meant. To disobey Xerxes was to be less than the sea. This was not madness. It was demonstration, the theatre of absolute divinity. To his empire, Xerxes was not a man, but a mirror of Ahura Mazda, god of light and truth. His rage against the elements proved that even chaos itself could be colonized. But behind this performance of power was a system, a precise, bureaucratic machine that translated belief into obedience and obedience into death. Tens of thousands of laborers, conscripts, and slaves were forced to rebuild the bridges under threat of execution. The logs they cut became ledgers. The ropes they tied became signatures. Every resource of the empire, from grain to bone, was taxed to make the sea submit. To the Persians, the bridge was a miracle. To history, it was an invoice. Xerxes didn't just command men, he commanded reality. And in doing so, he turned divinity into infrastructure. A god's will enforced by rope, iron, and human breath. But if the empire's faith was built on submission, then what happened to those who stopped believing? That's where our story truly begins. The Persian Empire was not built. It was extracted. Every stone lifted in Xerxes' reign came from the ribs of someone expendable. To the ancient world, his monuments were marvels of engineering. To the people who built them, they were burial grounds disguised as bridges and canals. When Xerxes envisioned his empire, he saw not just territory, but continuity. Bridges, causeways, and canals were the arteries that connected Asia to Europe, the divine East to the mortal West. To him, they weren't mere logistics, they were liturgy. Each plank of the Hellespont Bridge, each channel carved into Mount Athos, was a sacrament to his divinity, proof that a god could reorder the earth itself. The imperial inscriptions praise him as King of Kings, Lord of the earth, the one who commands the waters. But those waters drank men by the thousands. Greek chroniclers wrote of the marvel. Persian records spoke of the cost. Rations for the builders, a handful of barley, a cup of sour wine, a threat of the whip. Those who faltered were thrown into the currents, not buried, not counted, only replaced. The empire kept its books, but not for lives. The dead were logged as material loss. Modern archaeology at the supposed sites of the Hellespont Bridge and the Athos Canal tells the same story. Bones without tombs, vertebrae with stress fractures from hauling, teeth worn to nubs from starvation. They were not slaves in name. They were subjects in faith, forced to believe that dying for the bridge was a holy privilege. Xerxes' brilliance was not in architecture, it was in conversion. He converted labor into devotion, submission into liturgy, and suffering into proof of order. By making death sacred, he made rebellion unthinkable. To refuse to build was to blaspheme. To die for the project was to serve eternity. This is where the Persian machine differed from its rivals. Rome punished rebellion, Persia ritualized it. Where Rome built amphitheaters to display obedience, Xerxes built canals to erase it, forcing men to dig their own metaphors of surrender. Economically, these projects drained entire provinces. Tax ledgers from Babylonia record abnormal levies of grain and copper during Xerxes' reign, feeding not the people, but the logistics of megalomania. Cities along the royal road were turned into supply depots, their labor redirected from farms to fortresses, their sons marched to death on the emperor's timetable. Yet, this extraction was justified under divine economy. Priests declared that the king's will was the will of Ahura Mazda. To question the demand for men or grain was to question God himself. In this sacred bureaucracy, every corpse became currency, every whip a tax. The Persian court celebrated the completion of the bridges with incense and music. Slaves were forced to dance upon the planks their comrades had died constructing, a choreography of obedience. When the first soldiers marched across, the empire chanted blessings, not for the living, but for those who had vanished beneath the waves. It was here that Xerxes' terror became indistinguishable from worship. The empire had learned to disguise pain as piety. Every new construction required both materials and martyrs. Each success demanded new sacrifices, until the line between offering and execution disappeared entirely. To understand Xerxes' Persia is to understand a civilization that industrialized obedience. His bridges were not meant only to cross water. They were designed to prove that even nature, even death, could be organized under command. But Poembi, or built on sacred violence, is never stable. A system that sanctifies pain must constantly feed it. As Xerxes' empire expanded, so did the appetite of its gods. And when faith begins to depend on fear, the question shifts. How long before fear itself needs an empire to survive? By the time the bridges stood firm across the Hellespont, Xerxes' empire was already built on something sturdier than rope or wood. It was built on submission. The Persian court did not merely demand loyalty, it manufactured it, ritualized it, and taxed it. Obedience was not a virtue, it was a public ceremony. Inside the marble halls of Persepolis, the seat of imperial administration, courtiers bowed 3 times before approaching the throne. But each bow was more than gesture. It was a form of taxation, the payment of dignity. To stand upright before the King of Kings was treason. To look directly at him, an act of blindness punished by blinding. The ritual was called proskinesis, the kiss of submission. Its purpose was simple: to make obedience visible and therefore unavoidable. When foreign envoys refused to perform it, Xerxes' officials recorded their hesitation as heresy. Some were executed not for disobedience, but for hesitation. The empire had codified reverence into law. Under the royal edicts, loyalty was a measurable resource, the empire's most renewable currency. Psychologically, Xerxes understood something few rulers dared to admit: fear can build faster than faith. Where faith required persuasion, fear required performance. By transforming fear into spectacle, Xerxes made it profitable. Every act of devotion was audited. Every display of reverence tallied like tax revenue. At the annual festival of renewal, governors from every province were summoned to Persepolis to present offerings, not of gold, but of people. Slaves, servants, and hostages were paraded as tribute, symbols of the emperor's universal dominion. Each governor was expected to kneel, touch the ground with his forehead, and swear fealty under the eyes of the priests of Ahura Mazda. The ritual's message was unmistakable. There was no distinction between spiritual worship and political obedience. Behind this theater of loyalty lay a surveillance apparatus unprecedented for its time. Royal inspectors, known as the king's eyes and ears, traveled across the empire disguised as traders or monks, listening for dissent. Their reports flowed back to Susa and Persepolis, where clerks recorded the whispers of millions in the same ledgers used for taxes and grain. It was not just an empire of land, it was an empire of listening. The result was a nation that policed itself. Fear became internalized, obedience automatic. Even laughter was political. When a satrap in Babylon was accused of mocking the emperor during a feast, he was flayed alive, his skin nailed to the chair where he had once dined. His replacement was made to sit upon it, a daily reminder that in Persia, authority was not inherited, but worn. This was the true genius, or pathology, of Xerxes' regime. To replace personal loyalty with ritualized terror, to transform the act of submission into an article of faith. By doing so, Xerxes ensured that fear no longer required his presence. The system ran itself, a self-sustaining cult of obedience. But a machine of fear cannot rest. Like a temple needing endless sacrifices, it consumes those who serve it. Even the nobles who enforce the system began to dread its appetite. Each report, each accusation, each bow was a gamble. Loyalty today could be treason tomorrow. In such a world, the only safety was silence. And silence, history tells us, is the first sound of collapse. Empires are remembered for their monuments, but Xerxes' genius was not in the monuments themselves. It was in the movement that made them possible. For every temple carved from stone, there were 1,000 roads of dust, ledgers of grain, and bodies moving in rhythm to imperial command. This was not merely empire as geography, it was empire as distribution. In the age of Xerxes, control was measured not in miles, but in rations. The empire's reach stretched from the Nile to the Indus, and every loaf of bread, every skin of water, every ounce of metal crossing that vast distance was a thread in the web of obedience. The Persians called it the Royal Road, 2,700 kilometers of surveillance disguised as progress. Every province on that road was both vain and hostage. Caravans carried not just goods, but intelligence, numbers, confessions, names. Toll stations were not checkpoints. They were confessionals where merchants paid their dues and their silence. Grain stores doubled as data centers. Accountants were priests of the empire's most sacred ritual, control. To supply Xerxes' invasion of Greece, entire harvests vanished from Mesopotamia. Farmers were ordered to surrender their wheat, their sons, and their beasts of burden. Royal scribes described it as the logistics of divinity. To sustain a god's war required offerings commensurate with creation itself. But the consequence was famine, silent, systematic famine that killed without rebellion. And yet, famine too served the empire. Where hunger spread, obedience followed. The satraps, regional governors, distributed grain in exchange for oaths, turning food into faith. Inscriptions unearthed from Babylon and Persepolis record these exchanges in chilling neutrality. Ex-people fed, ex-oaths renewed, ex-rebels corrected. Even taxation became an act of theology. Persian tax codes described tribute as returning what was already the king's. The people were not paying, they were repaying existence. To question a levy was to question divine order. Every transaction, every caravan, every granary was a small act of worship. The empire had transformed logistics into liturgy, supply into submission, paperwork into prayer. But within this machine of motion, fear remained its fuel. Messengers traveled with the speed of birds, bearing wax tablets etched with names. Each name marked a shortage, an inefficiency, or a suspect. To fall behind in shipments was treason. To hoard food was heresy. In the ledgers of Xerxes, lateness and blasphemy were written in the same ink. Archaeologists have found tablets in Elam and Sardis showing fines measured not only in silver, but in lashes. A merchant who delayed a delivery might lose a hand. A satrap who falsified accounts might lose his family. Commerce and cruelty became the twin engines of stability. This was the new frontier of power. The empire no longer needed to kill to dominate. It only needed to measure. The whip had evolved into the audit. Fear had been domesticated into bureaucracy. The brilliance of Xerxes' system lay in its invisibility. Unlike the spectacle of conquest, logistics left no corpses on display. It left paper, or clay, records instead, where terror was written in rations and weights. Control no longer looked like violence, it looked like management. But a system that measures everything eventually counts itself. As resources thinned, as distance multiplied, as whispers of revolt spread, the ledgers that once glorified the empire began to betray it. Each missing grain, each delayed caravan, each vanished worker became a ghost in the bureaucracy, a reminder that even the perfect machine of control cannot measure faith, only fear. And fear, when quantified too precisely, begins to erode itself. Because once the subjects learn the math of obedience, they also learn how to falsify it. The empire that conquered the sea was now drowning in its own numbers. By the summer of 480 BCE, the empire's hunger had crossed the sea. Xerxes stood at the head of the largest army the ancient world had ever seen, a moving city of men, animals, and fire. Behind him stretched Persia, before him Greece. But this was no longer conquest, it was retribution. The Greek city-states had defied his father, Darius, and humiliated Persia at Marathon. Xerxes inherited not only a throne, but a wound. He swore an oath before the priests of Ahura Mazda that he would make Greece kneel, and that Athens, the city of reason, would learn what divine wrath truly meant. When the Persian army reached Athens, the city was already deserted. The citizens had fled to the island of Salamis, leaving behind temples, statues, and silent streets. What Xerxes saw was not a city to capture, but an altar to desecrate. He ordered the temples of Athena burned, their gold melted into offerings for the Persian gods. The Parthenon's predecessor, the Old Temple, was reduced to ash, its columns cracked in the heat like bones. To Xerxes, this was not vengeance, it was theology. The destruction of Athens was an act of purification, the erasure of hubris. He was not destroying Greece, he was cleansing it. His scribes recorded the event not as war, but as ritual. In the royal archives of Persepolis, the burning of Athens appears alongside ceremonies of renewal, the same ink used for harvest festivals. To punish rebellion was to fertilize order. The logic was divine. Destruction became creation. Archaeology has confirmed the flames. Charred temple floors still bear the marks of Persian torches. Fragments of marble bear traces of soot so dense that modern microscopes find it fused with molten gold. It was not looting. It was liturgy in fire. But for all its symbolism, the act betrayed something deeper. Fear disguised as faith. The empire that once whipped the sea now feared erosion from within. To maintain control, Xerxes needed not victory, but spectacle. A visible sermon to remind the world that defiance was impiety, and that even reason, the pride of Athens, could burn. Psychologically, the burning of Athens served as catharsis for an empire drowning in its own tension. It offered Persia a moral inversion, the illusion that destruction was moral repair. Every torch lit on the Acropolis became a public exorcism of doubt. Every statue toppled was a mirror, reflecting back the empire's own fragility. The paradox of Xerxes' rule was now complete. His empire could build bridges across seas, but not trust across provinces. It could control distance, but not belief. To erase resistance, it had to erase itself, piece by piece, city by city. When Xerxes sailed away from the ruins of Athens, his ships glittered with stolen gold. But his empire had lost something invisible: legitimacy. The Greeks who watched their city burn did not see a god. They saw a man trying to prove he was one. And that is the danger of sacred violence. Once destruction becomes divine, there is no longer a difference between faith and fear. One must constantly feed the other. The flames of Athens would not end in Greece. They would return home, to Persepolis, where the empire's temples, built by slaves and sanctified by blood, would one day face the same fire. But before that reckoning, Xerxes' wrath had to run its full course, because divine order, once weaponized, never stops at the enemy. It turns inward. In Xerxes' empire, punishment was not secrecy, it was theater. Pain was not a byproduct of rule, it was the medium through which rule was expressed. The Persian court understood that to govern millions, fear had to become fluent, a language spoken in skin and silence. The ritual began where rebellion ended. When a satrap was accused of betrayal, the trial was swift and sacred. There was no courtroom, only a courtyard. The accused was bound to a stake, surrounded by officials, priests, and scribes. His confession was dictated by pain, his sentence by spectacle. Executions were not meant to erase treason, they were meant to record it. One chronicler describes the punishment of Ariandes, the satrap of Egypt, who once dared to mint his own coins. He was executed not in shadow, but at dawn. His silver coins melted into liquid metal and poured over his body. The empire's most literal interpretation of economic reform. To Xerxes, the message was immaculate. Currency, like loyalty, could not exist without circulation through suffering. Other punishments were designed to echo across provinces. Impaled bodies marked the roads from Babylon to Sardis, each post a punctuation in the empire's grammar of terror. Rebels were flayed, and their skins nailed to walls of their cities. Traitors' families were buried alive beneath new fortresses, foundations consecrated with blood. But cruelty alone does not sustain an empire. Its brilliance lies in bureaucracy. Persian law required that every execution be recorded: name, crime, method, audience. Pain was standardized, not improvised. The number of lashes was prescribed, the materials of torture itemized. Even agony had a budget. This administrative precision gave violence an aura of legitimacy. Punishment was no longer vengeance, it was process. A rebellion was not suppressed, it was accounted for. The very act of documentation turned brutality into order. The psychological effect was devastating. When horror becomes paperwork, conscience disappears. Officials no longer felt complicit. They felt efficient. A system that could categorize agony could justify it. And in that justification, morality died quietly, stamped, sealed, and filed away. In Persepolis, archaeologists have unearthed tablets describing disciplinary logistics. One fragment reads, 2 rebels bound, 20 lashes for hesitation, 50 for speech. The record continues. Execution conducted with witnesses to ensure divine compliance. No detail omitted. Not the weapon, not the wind, not the witnesses. This was not cruelty out of control. It was cruelty controlled perfectly. The rituals served another purpose: memory. Punishment turned rebellion into warning, but it also immortalized the empire's authority. The victims became living inscriptions, bodies as billboards. Their suffering carried a message. The empire hears, sees, and remembers. In time, this system no longer needed rebellion to operate. It punished not to correct, but to remind. Fear became cyclical, an ongoing sacrament. Every lash reaffirmed divine order. Every scream renewed the contract between God and subject. It was maintenance disguised as morality. Yet within that perfection lay decay. When terror becomes predictable, it loses its edge. Spectacle turns to monotony. Fear becomes routine. The empire began punishing more frequently, not because of more crimes, but because its audience was growing numb. The language of pain had become too familiar, and like all languages, once overused, it began to lose meaning. Still, Xerxes persisted. He believed that if the empire ever stopped performing its rituals of control, it would collapse into silence. He was right, but not in the way he thought. Because silence does come, not from obedience, but from exhaustion. And no empire, however divine, can survive when fear has spoken itself hoarse. By the mid-years of Xerxes' reign, the empire no longer relied on faith or force, it relied on fear. But fear, like any commodity, had to be mined, refined, and distributed. It had to be measured, exchanged, and recorded. The Persian Empire became the first civilization to industrialize emotion. In the royal archives at Persepolis, accountants worked beside priests. Their ledgers listed not only taxes, but signs of loyalty. An entry might read, "Tribute of copper, 1,200 talents. Tribute of fear, adequate." The phrase may sound poetic, but it was literal. Fear was a measurable resource, gauged by the tone of public silence, by the absence of complaints, by the number of denunciations filed. Each province was required to send reports to Susa detailing its climate of order. The data was precise. Number of whispers overheard, number of seditious songs suppressed, number of informants rewarded. To Xerxes, this was not tyranny. It was administration. Every emotion had a ledger. Every whisper had a receipt. This is how the empire monetized terror. Citizens could buy safety by betraying neighbors, earn favor by exaggerating threats, or erase guilt by inventing conspiracies for others to confess. The more fear circulated, the more stable the empire appeared. And in that cycle, fear became self-sustaining, a psychological tax that citizens paid with their voices. The king's eyes and ears, once mere inspectors, became the merchants of anxiety. They sold reassurance to those who paid, suspicion to those who didn't. Their true currency wasn't gold or silver, but attention. Who the empire watched mattered less than the fact that it was always watching. Archaeological records reveal that shrines and tax offices were often built side by side. It wasn't coincidence. To worship and to report became indistinguishable acts. When people prayed, they were also confessing their fears. When they paid taxes, they were reaffirming divine hierarchy. The empire had merged spiritual and fiscal economies. Fear collected interest on both. This fusion was psychologically elegant. It relieved citizens of responsibility. Their terror was patriotic. To live in fear was to prove loyalty. The more one trembled, the safer one appeared. In this way, Xerxes solved the oldest problem of power: how to make oppression feel participatory. By institutionalizing fear, he made it voluntary. No one needed to be forced to obey. They obeyed to feel secure. Obedience became not submission, but insurance. But like all currencies, fear devalues when inflated. As reports multiplied, as spies competed for royal favor, the empire began to drown in paranoia. Every whisper became potential treason, every silence suspicious. Officials falsified threats just to prove vigilance. The administrative machine, once lubricated by trust, now ran on accusation. In the tablets from Persepolis, you can trace this decline like a heartbeat. Early records mention grace and order. Later ones, errors, hesitation, mistrust. The word confidence disappears entirely. What replaced it was audit. And that is the ultimate paradox of Xerxes' empire, a system that measured fear so perfectly that it became afraid of itself. Governors spied on generals, generals spied on priests, priests spied on scribes. The entire imperial pyramid was inverted. Everyone watching everyone, and no one sleeping soundly. The economy of fear had consumed its own market. It no longer needed enemies, it created them. Suspicion became a form of currency so powerful that it replaced gold. By the end of Xerxes' reign, officials were paying bribes not to gain favor, but to erase their names from lists, to be unseen. And that's the cruel irony of divine power. Once fear becomes a system, even the gods must submit to it. Because fear, unlike gold, does not accumulate, it circulates. And like blood pumped too hard through fragile veins, it eventually bursts the body that created it. Every empire eventually builds its own reflection, a mirror not of glory, but of consequence. For Xerxes, that mirror appeared not in Greece, but within the borders of his own dominion. It began quietly, not with armies, but with absences. Reports from the western provinces slowed, tax shipments arrived light, grain stores half empty. At first, the clerks blamed weather, then bandits, then miscommunication. But the truth was simpler. People had stopped believing the empire was watching. The machinery of fear depends on visibility. Once subjects stop looking over their shoulders, the entire illusion collapses. The watchers lose their power the moment the watched look away. The first rebellion flared in Egypt, a province that had endured a century of Persian rule. Its people knew the rituals of obedience by heart: how to kneel, how to stay silent, how to pretend faith. But in the 10th year of Xerxes' reign, they simply stopped pretending. The revolt was led not by soldiers, but by scribes, the very men who once kept the empire's ledgers of loyalty. They forged documents declaring divine independence from Persepolis, rewriting the language of empire with the ink it had taught them to use. Their rebellion was not in swords, but in sentences. It spread faster than any army could march. When Xerxes learned of it, he reacted not with confusion, but recognition. He had always known that control bred resistance. What he had not expected was that his system would teach rebellion how to speak in its own dialect. The empire's bureaucracy had produced its own revolutionaries, literate, efficient, and terrifyingly organized. Xerxes' retaliation was absolute. The Egyptian temples were seized, priests executed, libraries burned. Scrolls written in defiance were shredded and mixed with mud to seal new bricks for imperial buildings, a physical rewriting of memory. To destroy rebellion, Xerxes built with its remains. Yet even this act betrayed a deeper fracture. Revolts erupted next in Babylon, then in Bactria, each smaller but more symbolic. Every rebellion mirrored the empire's structure. Leaders formed councils, collected tributes, issued decrees. They didn't destroy the system, they imitated it. They had learned from Xerxes that authority required performance, and that was the true contagion: mimicry. When subjects begin to copy the rituals of the ruler's uniqueness dissolves. Power, once mirrored, loses its divinity. Psychologically, Xerxes' empire was now facing the consequence of its own theology. He had claimed to embody order, yet his system had trained chaos to look exactly like him. Every new rebellion repeated his gestures: decrees in gold ink, public rituals, divine proclamations. Each uprising was a distorted reflection, a reminder that the empire's image had escaped its control. The Persian chroniclers called this period the time of doubt. Reports from satraps became inconsistent, filled with euphemisms. Minor disorder, adjustment of faith, temporary silence. But beneath the euphemisms lay exhaustion. An empire that required constant vigilance had finally blinked. In Babylon, the revolt ended with a silence even more dangerous than battle. When Persian troops reclaimed the city, they found the temples empty, the streets deserted. The citizens had withdrawn, not to fight, but to refuse. Refusal, in its purest form, is rebellion without movement. It starves the empire of the attention it needs to exist. For the first time, Xerxes faced an enemy who did nothing. No chants, no armies, no slogans, just quiet. And against quiet, even divinity has no weapon. That was the mirror of rebellion, the reflection in which Xerxes saw his empire inverted. Every structure he built to command obedience had taught his subjects how to command their own defiance. They had learned bureaucracy, ritual, and spectacle from him, and turned them inward. The empire had conquered the world by organizing fear. Now, fear itself was organized against it. By the 13th year of Xerxes' reign, the empire still looked whole on the surface. The roads gleamed, the taxes arrived, the temples exhaled smoke. But beneath that ritual rhythm, something essential had decayed. The empire still functioned, but only mechanically. Belief, the invisible fuel that once set its heart ablaze, had burned out. Fear had long been the empire's bloodstream. Now it had congealed into paralysis. Orders issued slower, reports came later. Officials hesitated to act, priests hesitated to pray. Every decision waited for approval from a silence that no longer answered. For the first time, Xerxes' machinery of control confronted its natural enemy: stillness. In theory, the King of Kings ruled by divine law. In practice, he now ruled over statues, living bodies emptied of conviction. It was the same empire, but drained of pulse. The divine order that Xerxes had crafted, where every command carried the scent of godhood, was collapsing under its own excess. He had stretched holiness too far. When everything is sacred, nothing is sacred. When every word of the ruler is divine, even silence becomes blasphemy. In the archives of Persepolis, scribes began to abbreviate his titles. They no longer carved "Chosen of Ahura Mazda" on every inscription, not from rebellion, but embarrassment. Even gods, it seemed, could become bureaucratic errors. Inside the palace, music stopped. Harp strings collected dust. Choirs disbanded. The corridors of marble turned into mausoleums of noise, monuments to a faith that had forgotten how to echo. Servants learned to walk without sound. Mirrors, once symbols of illumination, multiplied Xerxes' solitude. The man who had commanded the sun now sat surrounded by its dim reflections. He spent nights wandering the Hall of Nations, its walls carved with images of conquered ambassadors bringing gifts. He touched their stone faces and whispered, "Do you still kneel? Do you still see me?" The stones, faithful as ever, said nothing. That silence became his new theology. Some chroniclers claimed madness, but perhaps it was something worse: lucidity. He had lived long enough to realize that divinity was nothing but a reflection polished by fear. When fear fades, the mirror clouds, and without reflection, even gods vanish. The spiral of paranoia deepened. Xerxes began suspecting his bloodline. He accused his half-brother Macestes of treason, and ordered him executed without trial. He purged his own court, one silence at a time. A cough could be conspiracy. A lowered gaze could be a threat. The empire that once executed rebels now executed hesitation. Outside Persepolis, famine crept through the satrapies. Rivers silted, caravans slowed, cities shrank. In Babylon, priests locked the temple doors. In Egypt, the sacred hymns ceased. Not because of rebellion, but because the singers had no faith left to sing. The empire's perfection had outlived its purpose. It ran too smoothly to feel alive. The clerks still stamped tablets, the soldiers still saluted. But their obedience had become muscle memory, the final stage of devotion before decay. And still, the God King refused to sleep. He dined alone after sunset, surrounded by mirrors. Each flame multiplied into 100 trembling images of himself. He would raise his cup and toast the reflections, the only audience left that could not betray him. The more his reflection multiplied, the less real he became. The priests continued to call him divine, not out of faith, but out of habit. They bowed when he entered the temple, but their bodies bent like reeds before a wind that had long ceased to blow. That is how divinity ends, not with rebellion, not with blood, but with boredom. The silence of disbelief is gentler than revolution, but far more final. A god who cannot terrify is merely a man in need of applause. By his 15th year, Xerxes no longer ruled an empire. He presided over its echo. Every decree he issued sounded like a prayer whispered into an empty hall. The divine order he had built so perfectly was now nothing more than architecture waiting for a funeral. And that was the true tragedy of Xerxes. Not that he went mad, but that he saw too clearly. He had risen above humanity only to discover that no one was looking up anymore. He had become a god so thoroughly that belief itself no longer had a place to live. That is the end of sacred order, when obedience survives faith, and the divine becomes administrative. The fall of Xerxes was not the end of a man. It was the end of the illusion that any man can make obedience eternal. Death came to Xerxes not as vengeance, but as routine. No rebellion, no thunder, no grand collapse of heaven and earth. Only a blade in a room already too silent to echo. It was the year 465 BCE. Outside, the Persian summer hung so still that the torches in the palace barely swayed. Inside, the emperor who had once commanded the largest army in human memory slept beneath linen embroidered with his own titles: King of Kings, Shadow of God, Light of Ahura Mazda. Before dawn, two figures entered his chamber: Artabanus, captain of the royal guard; Aspermitris, the chamberlain. Both men had served him for decades. Bowing so often, their spines had learned the angle of worship. Tonight, they bowed for the last time. They came with duty as disguise. Inspection of the guard, adjustment of a curtain. Gestures rehearsed in hundreds of nights before this one. When they drew the knife, no one screamed. The servants outside had long ago been trained that silence was loyalty. When the blade entered flesh, history did not thunder, it exhaled. To the Persians, the act was heresy. To the conspirators, it was housekeeping. To history, it was poetry. Because Xerxes had built an empire on surveillance, and died because he finally stopped watching. At sunrise, the palace performed its own denial. Courtiers filed into the hall of audience and bowed to an empty throne. Priests lit incense to a god who no longer breathed. The ritual continued because habit, once perfected, can outlive belief. For hours, the illusion of divinity held, as if ceremony itself could will the corpse to stay divine. By noon, rumor leaked through the corridors like smoke. The god king was dead, not felled by Greeks or rebels, but by proximity, killed by those closest, by the gravity of his own system. And the empire did not collapse, it adjusted. Artabanus seized the young prince Artaxerxes and proclaimed himself protector. For 7 months he ruled through the boy, issuing decrees in Xerxes' name. Then he, too, was executed. Proof that power, like faith, cannot be shared without blasphemy. Yet the most revealing story is not who killed Xerxes, but why no one tried to save him. There were no guards bursting through doors, no priests rushing to defend the sacred body. After 30 years of absolute rule, his court had learned the final lesson of tyranny. When everything revolves around one man, the world stops when he does. In that stillness, Persia's theology cracked. The divine right of kings, the sacred geometry that had justified so much pain, was exposed as theatre. The god had died exactly as a man dies. No celestial fire descended, no light crowned the roof of Persepolis, no tremor shook the desert. Only a body cooling faster than the myth surrounding it. The chroniclers who survived wrote with deliberate restraint. They did not describe the blood or the breath. They simply noted that the empire passed into shadow. A phrase so calm, it sounds like mercy. But it is the calm of historians who know they are recording a death too large for language. For the Persians, it marked the end of an age of gods. For posterity, it revealed a truth far colder. Even divinity could be replaced by administration. Xerxes' death did not destroy the system. It proved the system no longer required him. The scribes kept writing, the taxes kept flowing, the guards kept patrolling corridors, already haunted by their own obedience. The machine endured. The god had been necessary. That is the real horror of absolute order. When it becomes so efficient, it can continue without the will that created it. Xerxes dreamed of eternity and built bureaucracy. He sought to fuse theology with law and discovered that once fused, law devours theology. In that sense, his assassins were not men, but mechanism. Artabanus only delivered the knife. History had already done the cutting. The empire had learned to kill its maker the same way a body rejects an organ that has ruled too long. Centuries later, Greek historians mocked him as the mad tyrant who whipped the sea. They turned his death into morality play, hubris punished by divine justice. But archaeology whispers another verdict. His end was not punishment, it was entropy. Faith had thinned, fear had replaced belief so completely that when the god king fell asleep, even terror forgot to wake him. That is how empires die, not in flame, but in habit, not through revolt, but through repetition. A system built to never stop eventually forgets why it moves. Xerxes was buried with the precision of paperwork. The ceremony unfolded flawlessly, priests chanting from conflicting scripts, officials debating which hymn suited a being who was both deity and corpse. They settled on compromise, half praise, half elegy. Contradiction, signed into law. In his tomb at Naksh-e-Rostam, archaeologists centuries later found no triumphal inscriptions, no hymns to eternal light, only a single unfinished line, chisel-halted mid-word, as though the craftsman had paused, uncertain whether to carve for God or man. Perhaps that hesitation was no accident. Perhaps it was the first honest sentence of Xerxes' reign, a sentence that ends where meaning collapses. When the imperial ledger finally closed, it recorded not victory, not faith, not wrath, only silence. The divinity had expired, and the only god left to inherit the empire was the one that devours all monuments alike: time. When Xerxes died, the empire did not end, only the illusion that it needed a god to survive. The machinery of rule kept turning, slow but precise, like a heart that continues beating out of habit long after the soul has fled. Fear had become self-sustaining. It no longer required an architect or a command. It was now a systemic reflex, an ecosystem of obedience that breathed on its own. Reports, audits, denunciations, each one a small pulse in a nervous system that no longer needed a brain. The empire had achieved what every tyrant dreams of: the automation of terror. This was Xerxes' true immortality. He left behind no philosophy, no school of thought, no divine revelation. What survived was a process, a network of compliance so efficient it could terrify itself without his voice. His son, Artaxerxes, inherited not a throne, but a labyrinth. He ruled through corridors lined with ghosts of loyalty, advisors who spoke in whispers, scribes who wrote with trembling hands, servants who bowed before empty rooms, just in case someone was watching. The empire's foundations still held, but they held like the ribs of a corpse, intact but hollow. Across the satrapies, taxes still flowed toward Persepolis. Merchants still stamped the royal seal onto contracts. Festivals still honored the King of Kings. But no one believed the rituals anymore. They obeyed not out of conviction, but because they had forgotten how not to. That was the perfection of Xerxes' design. He had transformed obedience from an act into a reflex. Faith could be doubted, reflex could not. When fear becomes instinct, it no longer needs justification. That was the purest form of control, submission without consciousness. Centuries later, Rome would perfect the same principle. Emperors like Domitian and Diocletian treated fear as architecture, something to be built, measured, and renovated. They raised marble palaces, but the real walls were invisible. Laws designed to trap thought, rituals meant to exhaust resistance, and bureaucrats trained to serve the system, not the man. When the emperor fell, the machine remained. That endurance, that was Xerxes' legacy. A ghostly echo traveling through stone, decree, and ritual. Even the Greeks, who celebrated their victory over Persia, quietly absorbed fragments of his method. They mocked the god-king's pomp, but borrowed his psychology. They replaced his temples with assemblies, his priests with orators, his rituals of submission with ceremonies of consensus. The costumes changed, the choreography did not. From Persia to Rome, from Byzantium to Abbasid Baghdad, the architecture of fear evolved, but never vanished. Every empire that studied how to control belief found themselves, knowingly or not, following Xerxes' blueprints. They learned that fear was cheaper than faith, faster than persuasion, and infinitely more reliable than love. That's the paradox of empire. Every government that fears rebellion eventually becomes a mirror of the tyrant it once overthrew. Fear is the one inheritance power never refuses. Archaeology confirms what philosophy only suspects. Beneath the reliefs of Persepolis, those serene rows of courtiers bringing gifts, excavations revealed something less ceremonial. Narrow corridors, blind chambers, and stone doorways sealed from within. A literal architecture of surveillance. Every craftsman, every priest, every messenger moved beneath carved eyes that never blinked. The empire had engineered omnipresence. Theological control turned spatial geometry. Even centuries later, in Islamic chronicles, the caliphs of Baghdad were called Zil Allah fil, the shadow of God on earth, a phrase hauntingly close to Xerxes' own. Power, it seems, recycles its vocabulary. Only the gods' names change. But perhaps the most enduring legacy lies not in stone, but in the psychology Xerxes forged. The Persian Empire was not just the first empire of roads and couriers. It was the first empire of perception, a civilization engineered to make every subject feel seen, not known, not valued, simply observed. And that sensation outlived the empire itself. It metastasized into modern systems, courts, offices, bureaucracies, corporations. Paper replaced clay, audits replaced oracles. But the impulse was identical, to make humans believe they are always being watched, even when no one is. That is the perfection of fear, when it becomes invisible, when it needs no king, no whip, no overseer, when the mind itself becomes the guard tower. In that silence, Xerxes lives on, not as a villain, but as a template. Every regime that confuses order with virtue, every religion that mistakes silence for faith, every institution that prizes efficiency over meaning, is one of his descendants. Fear, in the end, is the most stable empire of all. It needs no armies. It builds no monuments. It simply replicates, inside language, inside law, inside memory. The bridges Xerxes built across the Hellespont were not his real monuments. The true bridge was psychological, a span connecting divine terror to human governance, crossed and recrossed by every ruler since. And that, perhaps, is the truest form of immortality. Not to be remembered, but to be repeated. Because what Xerxes created did not die with him. It became the operating system of civilization itself. The idea that stability requires fear, that silence equals peace, that obedience is salvation. History calls it empire. Philosophy calls it order. But bones call it what it was, a beautifully managed horror. History prefers noise. It remembers the clang of swords, the roar of crowds, the speeches of kings. But what survives the longest is not the sound of power, it's the silence that follows it. When the empire of Xerxes collapsed into administration and memory, the loudest thing left behind was what could no longer speak. Bones. In the ruins of Persepolis, archaeologists found them beneath the treasury hall, small, bent, unceremonious. They did not belong to warriors. They were workers, buried where they fell, their bodies sealed beneath the same floors that once stored gold. Their ribs were twisted from lifting stone, their wrists fractured by repetition. The bones of men and women who built eternity, only to vanish beneath its weight. No inscription records their names. The empire called them resources. Yet their remains record more faithfully than any chronicle. Each compressed spine is an invoice, each worn tooth a receipt. And in their ledger, the numbers do not celebrate, they accuse. Archaeology does not romanticize, it audits. It exposes the mathematics of divinity. For every column that still stands, there are hundreds of vertebrae that broke to raise it. For every mile of royal road, 100,000 footsteps that never returned. That is the accounting of power, the invisible cost that keeps the visible upright. When Xerxes declared himself divine, he thought he was transcending humanity. In truth, he was erasing it. He imagined that to rule forever, he had to extract compassion, emotion, hesitation, anything fragile enough to die. But those were the very elements that made life endurable. Without them, empire could function, but not live. His bridges, his canals, his palaces, every monument to eternity, rotted faster than the bones of the builders. Stone forgets faster than suffering, and suffering, unlike stone, remembers perfectly. Centuries later, the chroniclers who mocked him as a fool could still walk through his ruins and feel the presence of those who were never recorded. The bones underfoot turned history itself into evidence. They were not artifacts, they were witnesses. The tablets of Persepolis confirm the testimony. Rows of cuneiform accounts, grain, wine, rations, each line a heartbeat in clay. One entry reads, "Worker, unnamed. Task, lifting timber. Status, exhausted." Another adds, "Payment, none." They are not records of rebellion. They are death certificates disguised as administration. Those ledgers are the last honest historians of Xerxes' reign. They contain no moral lesson, no poetry, only proportion. And proportion is enough to condemn. An empire that measured labor so precisely could not measure mercy at all. That, perhaps, is why Xerxes' story still matters. He was not a monster, apart from his time. He was its culmination. He perfected a kind of order that would outlive him. The order of systems that function without empathy. The dream of eternity realized as paperwork. He did not invent bureaucracy. He sanctified it. And in doing so, he built the prototype for the world that followed. Rome copied his administration. Byzantium inherited his rituals. Caliphs borrowed his language of sacred kingship. Modern governments borrowed his gaze, the omnipresence that sees all, forgets none, forgives nothing. Every camera lens, every census, every algorithm that measures worth by compliance is a faint echo of Xerxes' empire of observation. We like to imagine progress as the opposite of tyranny, but progress often merely updates its technology. Paper replaced clay, data replaced parchment, the tax became digital. Yet the impulse endures, to count, to record, to classify the human until the human disappears. Fear no longer needs whips, it has spreadsheets. The bones remind us that civilization has always mistaken efficiency for immortality. Every empire believes it can systematize eternity. But eternity, it turns out, belongs to decay. and decay has perfect memory. Look closely at any monument long enough, and you can feel it breathing, a slow erosion that sounds like truth. The marble cools, the inscriptions fade, but the bones beneath remain, holding their quiet argument with time. They are not interested in vengeance. They are interested in record-keeping. That is why archaeology matters. It is not nostalgia for lost grandeur. It is forensic theology, the re-examination of gods who were never divine, and of men who mistook obedience for salvation. The trowel and the brush replace scripture and sermon, and when the soil gives up its bones, history ceases to be myth. It becomes evidence. Those who listen hear the same sentence repeated through centuries. Power survives by forgetting the people who built it. Every kingdom, every company, every system that worships permanence follows Xerxes' path, from faith to fear, from meaning to maintenance. It begins with revelation and ends with accounting. When the archaeologist lifts a fragment of jawbone from the dust, when light touches enamel that hasn't seen the sun in 25 centuries, it is not resurrection. It is cross-examination. The past does not beg to be forgiven. It demands to be seen, because empires die twice. First in the body, then in memory. And if we do not listen to the bones, they are destined to return, not as ghosts, but as systems reborn under new names. The silence beneath Persepolis is not empty. It hums with unfinished sentences, with the faint echo of tools and prayers. It reminds us that beneath every order lies exhaustion, and beneath every glory, loss meticulously unacknowledged. Xerxes sought eternity and became a footnote, but the people he erased became the echo that endures. Their bones still speak, not of vengeance, but of proportion, not of punishment, but of proof. And perhaps that is the final lesson, that history's truest memorials are not carved in stone, but buried in dust, waiting for someone patient enough to listen. If you value the record, subscribe, because when the ledger closes, the bones still speak.